For over a century, the name Custer has evoked the image of a martyred American hero, a lone commander fighting to the last breath. But in the spring of 1864, the man behind the myth was in serious trouble. In a city governed by his political enemies, George Armstrong Custer was a liability. At 23, he was the Union's youngest general, but his rise was precarious. He was a conservative Democrat and a protege of George McClellan, a man the radical Republicans in Congress actively reviled. While Custer could lead a charge, he had no idea how to navigate a capital that wanted him gone. The solution wasn't found on the battlefield, but in his wife, Elizabeth Libbie Bacon Custer. She possessed the social intelligence her husband lacked. She mastered the room while he was busy mastering the ranks. Libbie realized that in Washington, a victory in the mud of Virginia meant little if the men holding promotion papers didn't like your politics. She decided to change their minds herself. Libbie spent her time in the Capitol hobnobbing with the very Republican senators who viewed her husband with suspicion. She lobbied them in parlors and at receptions, using her poise to soften George's image and line up the political sponsors he desperately needed. It worked. Her influence was a deciding factor in securing George's promotion to Major General just before the war's end. She had become the primary architect of his professional survival. When the war ended and the couple moved to the frontier, Libbie brought that social polish with her. She turned remote military outposts into hubs of Victorian refinement, hosting musical evenings and elaborate dinners that made their station a destination for the powerful. This reached its peak in 1872, when they hosted the Grand Duke of Russia for a highly publicized buffalo hunt. By bringing European royalty to the plains, Libbie moved George out of the category of a simple soldier and into the realm of a global celebrity. Through her efforts, a man who had been a political outcast was now a household name, seemingly too famous and too well connected to fail. That fame shattered on a June afternoon in Montana. The 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn was a total collapse of the Custer name. President Ulysses S. didn't wait for an inquiry to cast blame. He publicly condemned Custer, telling the press the massacre was brought on by Custer's own imprudence. The stakes were absolute. If the president's narrative held, George Custer would go down in history as a reckless failure who had disobeyed orders and led his men to their deaths. Libbie launched an immediate counterstrike. She bypassed the formal military channels and went straight to the source of public opinion, leveraging George's high-level contacts at the Associated Press to ensure her version of the story reached the public first. She understood that after a disaster, the first story to reach the telegraph wires becomes the historical record. To protect that record, she utilized a weapon the Army couldn't fight, the rigid social code of Victorian mourning. By presenting herself as the grieving, stoic widow, she made any criticism of George feel like an attack on her. In the 1870s, publicly disparaging a dead man while his widow was in the room was a social transgression few were willing to commit. This created a vacuum of accountability. Powerful generals like Philip Sheridan and Alfred Terry, who had plenty of reasons to criticize Custer's tactics, largely held their tongues to avoid the public backlash of bullying a widow. While the military was effectively silenced, Libbie worked with author Frederick Whitaker to rush a biography into print. It depicted George as a martyred hero, arriving in bookstores before the official Army reports could even be finalized. Libbie found a way to use her grief as a shield, ensuring the military's evidence remained buried under her mourning veil. Libbie knew that to win the long-term argument, she didn't just have to win the first round. She had to outlast the critics and witnesses until their voices faded away. Over the next several decades, she published a best-selling trilogy of memoirs. These books became the primary lens through which a generation of Americans viewed the frontier, casting George as the quintessential honorable officer. These books gave her financial independence and ensured that the last stand myth became the standard version of the story taught in schools and written in the papers. This shield stayed in place for 57 years, blocking attempts to revise the Little Bighorn's history. When Libbie died in 1933, revisionist histories finally broke through, bringing Custer's flaws to light. But after 6 decades of work, The hero myth was already too deep to fully erase. The massive bronze statues that still stand in his honor are the physical results of her life's work. History is often less about what happened on the battlefield and more about who is left to tell the story and how long they are willing to stand in its defense.